Whenever people mention the name Charles Manson, people usually think that it's a crazy man who ordered his family to kill a bunch of people in California in 1969. But who was Charles Manson? Welcome to another video of Life Before the Cult, where I deep dive into cult leaders' backgrounds to try and bring a understanding to why they became who they would become. If you somehow don't know who the Manson family is, or you just want a refresher course, click the link in the description below for the basic facts about the Manson family. Charles Miles Manson was born on November 12, 1934 in Cincinnati, Ohio, to a 15-year-old named Kathleen Maddox. Charlie would get his last name from his stepfather, William Manson, an older man who had served in the military. Charlie's biological father was a 23-year-old conman named Colonel Scott, who was married at the time he met Kathleen. But the moment he found out that Kathleen was pregnant, he skipped town. She would meet and marry William soon after. From a very young age, Charlie's mother was known to leave him with either his aunt or grandmother for days at a time while she disappeared. It's believed that she and her brother Luther were out conning people for money. But on April 30th, 1937, William filed for divorce from Kathleen, and in the report, William stated that Charlie was not his son, and William would never have anything to do with Charlie again. Between 1937 and 1938, Charlie and his mother lived on and off with relatives throughout Ohio until Kathleen decided to live with Luther and his girlfriend. Kathleen and her brother spent a lot of their time at bars trying to con men out of money, and on August 2, 1939, the two, along with Luther's girlfriend, were arrested for an assault and robbery from the night before. Kathleen was sentenced to 5 years in prison at Moundsville Penitentiary in Virginia since the crime took place there. Kathleen's family wanted Charlie to be able to visit his mother in prison as much as possible, so it was decided he would move in with his aunt's family, who were living in McMecken, which was only a few miles away from the prison. When Charlie lived here, he was noted to be a troubled child that was always lying and getting into trouble and never doing what he was told. It would also be here where Charlie would be enrolled in elementary school. Charlie wouldn't make good grades, he also had a very limited reading ability, and because of his small stature, he attracted bullies, which included his teacher. One such time that Charlie came home from school crying, his uncle punished him for it by making him wear a dress to school the next day. During his childhood, Charlie was known to be fascinated with knives and guns, but he was also known to love music so much so that he could sit at a piano and play songs by ear for hours. In late 1942, Kathleen was paroled after serving 3 years of her sentence. She would pick up work as a barmaid in McMecken, but the job wouldn't last very long. Soon after, Kathleen would take Charlie and move to Charleston, where she would work as a clerk at Van's Never Closed Market. Charlie would later state that the first few weeks here were the happiest time of his life. Kathleen re-enrolled Charlie into elementary school here, but this time Charlie would either skip school or not go at all. During this time, Kathleen was still known to go out to bars while leaving Charlie at home, and at one point she was arrested for grand larceny, but for unknown reasons, the charges were dropped. Soon after, Kathleen and Charlie left Charleston and drifted in and out of Indianapolis. Charlie later stated that his mother was prostituting at this time, but Kathleen denied it. In 1943, Kathleen began attending Alcoholics Anonymous, where she would meet and marry a man named Lewis that same year. Lewis joined the household but continued to drink and refused to have anything to do with Charlie, stating that Charlie was Kathleen's responsibility. Around the time of the marriage, Charlie had begun to steal things, and when he would get caught, he would state he did it because of someone else. And a couple of years later, Charlie would begin to run away from home for short periods of time. In 1947, Kathleen had given up trying to discipline Charlie, so she sent him to the Gibault School for Boys in Terre Haute, Indiana. This school was ran by Catholic priests and held boys between the grades of 5th and 10th. The boys would be required to attend daily religious services and work on the 150-acre farm that provided food for the school. And staff were known to enforce rules by paddlings with a yard-long board. Charlie would later state that the school was ran like a prison and that he was paddled on a regular basis. All new students had to undergo psychological testing, and Charlie stated that he had a tendency towards moodiness and a persecution complex. Charlie would run away from the school a few times, always returning to his mother, who would send him back. But in October of 1948, Charlie didn't return to his mother. Instead, he broke into a few small stores and took enough money to rent a room for himself. But he would be caught shortly after when trying to break into another store. This time, instead of sending him back, the judge sent Charlie to Boys Town in Omaha, Nebraska, which had been made famous by the movie Boys Town. But 4 days after arriving, Charlie and another inmate escaped, stole a car, and headed to Peoria, Illinois, where the other inmate's uncle was known to be a successful thief that could have them work for him. But on the way there, the two stole a gun and committed 2 armed robberies at a grocery store and a casino. 2 weeks after the boys had begun to work for the uncle, Charlie was arrested when he was caught breaking into a business. This arrest led to the connection of the other armed robberies. Charlie would be sent to the Indiana Boys Reform School in Plainfield. This school housed boys between the ages of 10 and 21, with charges ranging from minor to manslaughter. Physical discipline here was left to the adult staffers for whatever they saw fit. Charlie would later claim that almost immediately after arriving, he was gang raped by other boys who were encouraged to do so by a staff member. He also stated that it happened so often that he developed a detached view on rape. In retaliation, Charlie came up with what he called the insane game, where he would act crazy to keep potential assailants to leave him alone. Charlie tried to escape from the Reformatory various times, but in February 1951, Charlie escaped with 2 other inmates, stole a car, and headed west. But 3 days later, they were caught just outside Beaver, Utah. This time, they faced a federal charge for driving a stolen vehicle across state line. All 3 were sentenced to the National Training School for Boys in Washington, D.C., where they were ordered to remain until their 21st birthdays. This school requires an aptitude and intelligence test as soon as inmates arrive. Charlie was judged as illiterate, but with an above-average IQ at 109. His caseworker also noted that Charlie was aggressively antisocial and that he had a terrible sense of inferiority. Most of the boys here aimed to get the opportunity to be transferred to the minimum security Natural Bridge Honor Camp in nearby Virginia. On October 24, 1951, Charlie was sent there on recommendation from his psychiatrist. Charlie was set for an early parole in February of 1952, but 1 month before, Charlie was caught raping another boy while holding a razor blade to the boy's throat. Charlie was denied parole and sent to the Federal Reformatory in Petersburg, Virginia. Charlie continued to get into trouble until he was transferred to a maximum security reformatory in Chillicothe, Ohio, where his behavior suddenly changed. The entire year of 1953, Charlie didn't get into trouble. He raised his reading and math skills from 4th grade to 7th grade. He also worked for the Reformatory's transportation unit, where he had done maintenance work on the facility's cars and trucks. In January of 1954, Charlie received an award for meritorious service. Then he was paroled in May of that year. Charlie went between living with his aunt to his mother, but he would spend most of his time with his grandmother. His grandmother made him attend Sunday morning church services with her at her Nazarene church. She also made him join the church's Sunday school class for teenagers, where he would attend meetings and participate in social functions. But Charlie was shunned from the group, allegedly because he would brag about being in reformatories, running from the law, and doing drugs. Charlie stopped hanging around the teenagers and began to hang around with adults, including one named Clarence Willis, who would introduce him to his daughter Rosalie. The two would begin to date, and then only months later, on January 17, 1955, the two were married. The two moved into their own place while Charlie worked 2 jobs. It was around this time that Charlie got his hands on a guitar and began to teach himself how to play. A few months into their marriage, Rosalie became pregnant, and Charlie felt his jobs weren't making enough money to support his growing family, so he began to steal and sell cars. In July of 1955, Charlie decided to visit his mother, who had moved to California the previous year, so he stole a vehicle and headed to Los Angeles with Rosalie. The two lived with Kathleen while Charlie worked odd jobs, but he continued to use the stolen vehicle. That September, Charlie was arrested because of it. He pled with the judge for leniency, claiming that he had been confused ever since being released from the reformatory, so the judge ordered psychiatric testing. During questioning with the psychiatrist, Charlie admitted to stealing more cars in Ohio and to beating Rosalie because he couldn't control his temper, but he stated he loved her and wanted to be there for the birth of his son. On November 7th, Charlie was given 5 years of probation, but he would have to return to court in February to face charges for the other cars he had admitted to stealing. Instead, Charlie and Rosalie would flee to Indianapolis. On March 10, 1956, Rosalie gave birth to Charles Manson Jr. But 4 days later, Charlie was arrested and taken back to Los Angeles. On April 23rd, Charlie's previous probation was revoked because he had fled, and he was sentenced to 3 years at San Pedro's Terminal Island Penitentiary in Los Angeles Harbor for both car theft and fleeing. While here, Charlie befriended pimps and learned their tactics on manipulating and controlling women. He was also only allowed to work with small groups because he had a tendency to misbehave with the larger ones. Rosalie would also file for divorce from Charlie while he was here and moved to Appalachia with Charlie Jr. At this time, prisons had tried to move on to rehabilitating prisoners rather than just punishing them. They began to give programs to inmates, including school diplomas, but the one program that interested Charlie the most was the Dale Carnegie course that covered his 1936 book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Charlie would end up being an outstanding student in this course, but he would quit before finishing it, stating he had learned everything he needed to know. On April 10, 1957, Charlie was caught in the prison parking lot wearing civilian clothing and trying to hotwire a car. He would receive 5 years of probation on top of his prison sentence. But the rest of Charlie's prison time, he was able to stay out of trouble. So much so that due to overcrowding, Charlie was picked for early parole on September 30, 1958. Outside of prison, Charlie worked jobs ranging from a busboy to a gas station attendant, but he usually ended up being fired. But on May 1st, 1959, Charlie was arrested for attempting to cash a forged U.S. Treasury check. A woman named Leona Musser appeared in mid-September and told Charlie's parole officer that she was pregnant with Charlie's child and pleaded for the charges to be dropped. In reality, Musser wasn't pregnant and she was one of Charlie's prostitutes, but the pleading worked. A deal was struck where Charlie would plead guilty to forging the check in return for the mail theft charge to be dropped. He received a 10-year suspended sentence and remained on probation. But shortly after, Charlie was arrested for violating the Mann Act when he transported 2 women, including Musser, from California to New Mexico for the purpose of prostitution. Charlie quickly married Musser because the courts couldn't force a wife to testify against her husband, but Musser, who was now actually pregnant by Charlie, chose to testify against him anyways. The Mann Act charges would be dropped, with Charlie's previous probation being revoked. He was sentenced to serve out the 10-year suspended sentence at McNeil Island in Washington's Puget Sound. Charlie's evaluation here stated that he hid his loneliness, resentment, and hostility behind a facade of superficial ingratiation. And it was noted that Charlie had said at this point that institutions had become his way of life and that he received security in these institutions that isn't available to him in the outside world. While here, Charlie would become involved with the Church of Scientology, a church that was founded by science fiction writer L. Ron Hubbard in 1954 after his book Dianetics became a bestseller. But it's believed Charlie's interest in it was to learn manipulation tactics and or to make prison officials believe he was bettering himself. This is also the time that Charlie would pick up guitar techniques from fellow inmate and 1930s infamous bank robber Alvin Karpis, who was an accomplished steel guitar player. In early 1961, Musser gave birth to Charlie's second son, Charles Luther Manson. The two would divorce in 1964. That same year, Charlie would hear the Beatles on the radio for the first time. He stated from that moment on he was focused on becoming a bigger and more famous musician than the Beatles. He would begin to spend all of his free time writing songs and practicing guitar. By May of 1966, Charlie had kept a clean record and was transferred back to Terminal Island with the possibility of early parole. But an evaluation done on Charlie at this time stated that if he was paroled, he was going to need a lot of help transitioning back to the outside world. Less than a year later, when Charlie learned he was about to be paroled, he went to prison officials and told them that he didn't want to be paroled because he felt safer in prison and felt he wouldn't be able to adjust to the outside world. But on March 21, 1967, Charlie was released on parole. Charlie would end up going to Berkeley to stay with a fellow inmate that had already been paroled, being told to do parole check-ins at the San Francisco office. Not soon after, Charlie would begin to meet the people who would eventually make up his infamous family. Now you know Charles Manson's life before the cult. Let me know what you think caused him to become who he became. Thanks for watching.